November 2016, just a few days after Donald Trump was elected president, we had a 45-minute commercial-free discussion with award-winning filmmaker Michael Moore, Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude Jr., and author Anand Giridharadas. And this morning, we got the band back together. But first, a quick look back at some of that first discussion.
Somebody was remarking here about how the expense report for the Trump campaign showed they'd spent more money on ball caps that month than anything else. And your panelists were going, ball caps!
Right.
And I looked at that and I thought, wow, there's the bubble right there.
You saw all those caps being worn. People who go out and buy one and wear it every day are also going to vote.
Small town America is as incurious about other places as we are about it, and that's
and small town America's job is not to educate America on the electoral process.
My fear for the very people you are talking about is that they voted for a populist with some amount of authoritarian tendencies.
Some amount.
And what they're going to get is an authoritarian with a little bit of populist speak.
So many elites in New York City who, let's face it, we can afford to go into the voting booth and be philosopher kings and rub our chins and say, well, you know, I'm going to make a point by not voting for either candidate. But, Michael, they don't have that luxury.
That's right.
90% of Americans don't have that luxury. They vote to survive.
A lot of people in this country feel that people are taking their stuff away, that they're deserving, they're working their behinds off, and they deserve more than what they're getting.
Right.
And the reason why they think they're not getting more than what they're deserving is because the big government is taking stuff from deserving people and giving it to undeserving people.
Right.
And the undeserving people are people that don't live in my neighborhood. They don't look like me. They don't have the same religion as I do. I don't want to marry my children. They are different than me.
And guess what?
Those people have been attracted to Trump, not these black folk, not these brown folk, not these Muslims who are catching hell. So part of what I'm trying to get out here is not that middle America lives in a bubble. It's not that I'm some Ivy League philosopher king going in and doing what I did. What I'm trying to get at is at the heart of this country is some deep racial animus that animates, right, the very communities that we're trying to lift up.
You have to accept that millions of people who voted for Barack Obama, some of them once, some of them twice, changed their minds this time.
So let's pick that up 2 years later. Eddie, Anand, and Michael Moore join us now again. Michael is out with a new documentary, Fahrenheit 11/9, which is in theaters nationwide this Friday. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Michael, you were one of the people, it wasn't the outcome you wanted, obviously, but who saw what was happening in the country in the days and the weeks and the months and the years, really, before Donald Trump was elected. What do you say 2 years after that conversation about what kind of president he's been?
Well, as bad as I thought, and I think some of us thought it was going to be, I think it's turned out to be much, much worse. We have somebody who really does not like democracy, is definitely prefers to rule as an autocrat, admires other autocrats. And you know, people ask me, well, who do you think the Democrats should run in 2020? And I'm not even thinking 2020. There's only one election right now, and that's November 6th, 2018. We may not get to 2020. I mean, this individual, this is how dangerous Donald Trump is. Because he doesn't believe in anything besides Donald J. Trump, the danger of having a malignant narcissist in charge of a country like this is we don't know what's going to happen. If we had a national emergency right now, what would he do? Well, first, to keep us safe, but most importantly, what would he do to rule by fiat, by a martial law, by whatever he would do? He would use this event to take away more of our rights. And you know, in the movie, I kind of show how this is not just kind of paranoid thinking or conspiracy theory thinking. This actually has happened a number of times throughout history, where people said, you know, yeah, it's okay, he's a little crazy, but he's not that bad. He is that bad. He is that bad, and You know, I watch your show every morning, and you've been discussing this now for almost 2 years. And it's clear to watch, especially with Joe and Mika, the sort of the level of where are you, Mika? Your belief in our wonderful system, and to watch the way that you and the others here on this panel have started to lose so much hope. And I don't blame you, and I don't think the American people blame you. And what I was saying that day is that that pink bubble that people were in, that what heroin addicts call the pink high, the sort of belief that, yeah, it's going to be great. She's going to win. We're going to have our first woman president. I'm hearing that right now about this election. We're going to get the House back. People are already believing that that's going to happen. For every minute that you spend believing that we're going to get the House back is a minute going toward that not happening. That the possibility of us having 2 more years of this, and then another term of Donald J. Trump, and people go, well, that won't happen. Well, that's what they said about Bush. W wouldn't get a second term. He wasn't elected the first time. People will come out the second time. I don't believe that. And I embrace every single day when I wake up the fact that this could be a 2-term Trump and that we won't win the House back on November 6th.
Mika?
Well, I'll tell you, Michael, I agree with you on that. I think everyone has learned not to prognosticate with too much confidence. We felt we saw something happening. And as you described the arc of our mindset as it's sort of transformed or evolved over the past 2 years, it's become not just a battle of left and right, not just a battle over just how bad or how far he will go. I don't think anyone actually had a sense of how bad this could be, if you think this is bad. But now it's a daily battle to maintain, establish, hold on to the truth. I think it's a very dangerous time. Joe is confident the institutions will hold. What do you think?
No, I love Joe, but he's wrong on this. It's good to see that he's still trying to cling to that hope. But right now, I think hope is the most dangerous thing we could have. I think that to sit and believe that here's the thing. Democracy does not have a self-correcting mechanism. So as we get closer and closer to the cliff, there's nothing that is going to pull us back. There's nothing. Democracy, the one we have, actually is just a piece of paper. And in each era, the humans, the people, the citizens, are the ones who determine how that piece of paper is interpreted and what we're going to live by and be by. But this is, nobody should believe that and I show this in the film, that Germany in the 30s was one of the most intelligent societies on earth. They were cultured. They read more books than any other country. They were well educated. They were a liberal democracy. The popular vote in 1932 was won by the liberal left parties. Hitler won with only 32% of the vote. And then they had a national emergency where their parliament was burned down through some sort of act of terrorism, and that was used as an excuse to do X, Y, or Z. Less than 2 weeks ago, this man who sits in the Oval Office suggested that the license of this very network that we are sitting here in the studio today we should consider what to do. Should NBC still have a license to broadcast?
And not for the first time, by the way.
And not for the first time. And he's not suggesting pulling some socialist rag that you could get on the corner outside Columbia University. He's talking about network people and this network because you might run something that he doesn't agree with. He believes he has the power. And let's just say, to his credit, he's really no different than most CEOs in the sense that they don't run their companies like a democracy. That's not how business is run. That's not what he's used to. And the ones who are billionaires, they like the fact that they've got more money than everybody else. And so they want the system rigged so that they end up with most of the pie, and everybody else fights for the crumbs. That's the system they like, and it's not called democracy. It is an autocracy. It is the way that they prefer to rule. It's the way he prefers to rule, and he just has a much larger and crazier version of it. But I think that our problem back 2 years ago is that people did not take him seriously.
Right.
He was just a joke. He's crazy. You know, he's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and that's it. And no, that wasn't it. I said then, I say it now, he outsmarted everybody. He outsmarted the campaign of maybe one of the smartest people ever to run for president. And he's still doing it. He's the master distractor. He's the king of the misdirect. And we're being played every day by him. The man is an evil genius. And it's odd that this very network that he wants to possibly pull the license from is the network that made him a beloved figure between the Hudson River and Interstate 5. That show, people loved Donald Trump, and the left and the liberals and Democrats didn't understand that every week America got to sit down and watch him tell the biggest jerk, and everybody works with that jerk, by the way. Everybody at work today in America has that person in the office, and they loved hearing him say, "You're fired, you're fired," and it was cathartic. Yeah. And nobody I knew even watched the show. They didn't even know what was going on and why he became so beloved.
Anand, Michael's right, absolutely right, of course, that not enough people took Donald Trump seriously as a candidate. Up till the last day, till Election Day, most people in the Hillary Clinton campaign, most people in the media didn't think he was going to win. Don't you think, though, that progressives and Democrats have been activated because of his election to act in 2018 and 2020? I know neither Joe Meek or I, and can't remember anyone on the set saying there's no way he'll win in 2020. I think just the opposite. People are on heightened alert because they were surprised by 2016.
I think I was thinking back to what did we know when we had that conversation, and what have we since learned? What couldn't we have known? I mean, I think we knew that he was a bad guy. He was a malignant narcissist. The evidence for that was in, right? I think the two things that get to your question of the future of kind of activism and people taking back the country, the two things we've learned are, to Joe's kind of faith in institutions, I think we've realized, at least from my point of view, and I think yours and some others, that we are actually as a country held together much more by culture and norms and acts of bravery than by institutions. And we have great institutions, but they haven't stopped him from a bunch of things, whether it's the Muslim ban, whether it's family separation, or whether it's declaring the media the enemy of the people and perhaps abetting the murder of journalists in Maryland through his rhetoric. We are held together by whether people are actually willing to step up. That's one of our biggest checks and balances. And in his own party, in his own squad, that bravery has been totally absent. We have been revealed, in at least that part of the country and his movement, to be a profoundly uncourageous country. The second thing that's been revealed is that the populace turned out to be, in his governing, a billionaire, just a kind of billionaire giveaway guy, a billionaire who's probably not even really a billionaire himself, giving money to other billionaires and using his time in the White House to screw the people who voted for him by giving them billions. And I think that is why, to come around to your point, there is an extraordinary thing happening in this country. That is, yes, it's about people running for office, and that's happening. Yes, it's about more women running for office than ever, and that's happening. But I think it's even evidence of something deeper. I think for 30 or 40 years, to go back to your CEO sort of point, 30, 40 years, we've believed a phony story about how we make change in this country, which is that it's kind of trickle down, it's companies, it's markets, it's Facebook, it's business. And I think we've realized, Trump has actually done us the enormous favor of realizing a country is no better than its public institutions. It's no better than its government. And I think there's an extraordinary moment looming after the Trump era, in which we have an age of reform in this country the way we did 100 years ago, and actually rebuild every aspect of our social contract, our social infrastructure, our deep systems, so that this never happens
Eddie, I
again.
want to get you in on one side. When you say it's an uncourageous country, you're talking specifically about Republicans in Congress.
Well, Republicans in Congress,
citizens?
but also his movement. Look, I know a lot of people, as all of us do here, who voted for him, who were attracted to him. I know how they live their personal lives. I know how they raise their kids. They're not like him. If any of their kids came home and said any of the things that he says, those kids would be thrown out of the house. If they were married to someone who treated them the way he has treated his spouse, they'd be kick the spouse out of the house. We have a lot of people in this country who would never tolerate in their church or in their softball team or in their company behavior that they're willing to tolerate from the President of the United States simply because they hate the other side and who the other side represents more.
Eddie, I got to get you to hold that thought for 1 second. We're going to sneak in a break. Right back with much more from Anand, Professor Glaude, Michael Moore, Michael Steele, and Susan Del Percio when we come right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.